New developments in the Blake Lively case are suddenly drawing intense attention, and a last-minute court filing is now raising serious questions about what may be coming next. Just as the federal judge signaled that key rulings could arrive soon, Blake Lively and her attorney, Michael Gotterly, appeared on the court docket with an unexpected legal move. The filing points directly to a Second Circuit Court decision and argues the judge should deny the defendant's motion for judgment on the pleadings. But the timing is what caught many observers off guard. The judge had just extended the deadline for pre-trial motions, a step that suggested major decisions, possibly involving summary judgment, could be imminent. And now this sudden filing is attempting to influence how the court evaluates the summary judgment record and the pleadings themselves. Many viewers following the case immediately notice the tension this creates, because if the judge proceeds with a ruling on the existing motions, the legal strategy behind Lively's claims could face a critical test. If you're following this story and want updates as new details emerge, subscribing helps you stay updated as everything continues to unfold. But that sudden filing is where the situation begins to tighten. Because the appearance of Blake Lively and attorney Michael Gotterly on the court docket didn't just add another document to the case. It introduced what lawyers call notice of supplemental authority. And the case they cited, Miller versus Lamanna, a ruling from the Second Circuit Court, is now being positioned as a reason the federal judge should deny the defendant's motion for judgment on the pleadings. On the surface, that might sound routine. Lawyers frequently cite new appellate decisions during active litigation. But this is where observers following the case began asking a different question. Why now? Because just one day earlier, the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York extended the deadline for pretrial motions by 1 week. That small procedural move immediately sparked speculation that the judge could soon rule on two major legal requests already pending in the case: the defendant's summary judgment motion and the judgment on the pleadings motion. Those rulings could determine whether major portions of the case move forward or end before trial. And that context makes the new filing far more significant. In the letter submitted to the court, Lively's legal team argued that the appellate ruling in Miller versus Lamanna confirms the judge should evaluate the claims using the summary judgment record rather than focusing strictly on the pleadings. In other words, they want the court to weigh the evidence gathered during discovery. But that request introduces a procedural tension, because the defendant's motion for judgment on the pleadings operates under Rule 12c, which traditionally asks a much narrower question: whether the complaint, answer, and attached documents establish a legally valid claim. Evidence collected during discovery normally becomes central during summary judgment, not necessarily when evaluating pleadings. And that difference is where the legal strategy begins to reveal itself. Because if the court focuses strictly on the pleadings, the strength of the claims could be tested much earlier than the plaintiffs may prefer. And that is the pressure point many legal observers say this filing may be trying to influence. But this is where the story becomes more complicated, because the precedent Lively's team cited may not actually match the procedural situation in this case. And that distinction could become extremely important in what happens next. But the entire strategy behind this filing hinges on one key reference: the appellate case Miller versus Lamanna from the Second Circuit Court. And this is where many observers say the legal argument becomes more complicated. In Miller versus Lamanna, the appeals court examined a situation involving summary judgment in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. After discovery had already taken place, the defendants asked the court for summary judgment, arguing that the evidence did not create any genuine dispute of fact. But instead of reviewing the summary judgment record, the district court focused only on the allegations inside the complaint, essentially treating the case like a motion to dismiss under Rule 12b-6. The Second Circuit Court determined that this was a procedural error. According to the appellate ruling, once discovery is complete and a case reaches the summary judgment stage, courts should evaluate the record evidence, not simply the pleadings. The appeals court ultimately vacated the judgment and remanded the case back to the lower court for further proceedings. That ruling is now the authority Blake Lively's legal team cited in their latest court filing. Their argument suggests that the same principle should apply here, that the federal judge must consider the evidence gathered in discovery rather than focusing strictly on the pleadings when evaluating the defendant's motion for judgment on the pleadings. But this is where the legal tension appears. Because in the Miller versus Lamanna situation, the district court effectively converted a summary judgment motion into a motion to dismiss, something the appeals court said was procedurally improper. In the Lively case, however, the motions before the court appear to be separate legal mechanisms, a summary judgment motion and a Rule 12c judgment on the pleadings motion. And if the judge treats those motions independently, the precedent from Miller versus Lamanna may not apply in the same way. That distinction could ultimately determine whether the argument raised in the filing carries significant weight, or whether the court views the precedent as legally distinguishable. And that is where the pressure inside the case may begin to build.
But this is where the legal mechanics of the case start to shift. Because the defendants in the Blake Lively lawsuit didn't rely on only one procedural motion. They filed two separate requests with the federal judge, a summary judgment motion and a motion for judgment on the pleadings under Rule 12c. And that distinction is central to what may happen next. A summary judgment motion asks the court to review the summary judgment record, meaning the evidence gathered during discovery, and determine whether there are any triable issues of fact that would require the case to proceed to trial. But a Rule 12c judgment on the pleadings works differently. Under Rule 12c, the judge typically evaluates the complaint, the answer, and documents incorporated into the pleadings, such as contracts, offer letters, or written agreements. The question becomes whether those materials, on their face, establish a legally valid claim. In this case, filings connected to the pleadings reportedly included items like a contract and an offer letter, documents that could potentially shape how the court evaluates the legal sufficiency of the claims. And this is where the strategic tension becomes clearer. Because if the court rules first on the motion for judgment on the pleadings, the analysis may focus heavily on the legal framework of the claims themselves, including questions about whether certain statutes apply or whether the pleadings meet the required legal standards. By contrast, if the court places greater emphasis on the summary judgment motion, the analysis shifts toward the evidence gathered during discovery. Those two approaches can lead to very different outcomes. Many viewers following the case began noticing this procedural crossroads once the last-minute authority filing appeared on the docket. The filing appears to encourage the federal judge to emphasize the summary judgment record rather than relying solely on the pleadings. And that raises an important question. Is this filing simply introducing a relevant appeals court precedent, or is it an attempt to shape the legal standard the court uses before issuing a ruling? That distinction could become increasingly important as the case moves closer to a potential decision. But the procedural debate is only one layer of what the federal judge may soon evaluate. Because beneath the dispute over summary judgment and Rule 12c judgment on the pleadings, the court is also examining the legal structure of the claims themselves. And this is where questions about the scope of certain laws have started drawing attention. Some of the arguments raised in the defendant's filings focus on whether particular statutes can apply outside the jurisdictions where they were enacted. This is often referred to as extraterritorial application of law, a principle courts frequently examine when lawsuits involve activities across multiple locations.
If a claim relies on laws that do not legally extend to the situation being challenged, a court may determine that the claim cannot move forward under that statute. And that issue intersects with another factor courts regularly analyze: whether multiple claims are duplicative. Federal courts sometimes review whether plaintiffs have asserted overlapping claims under both state law and federal law that seek the same remedies. In some situations, courts have determined that certain claims may be unnecessary if the same relief could already be obtained through existing federal statutes. This doesn't automatically end a case, but it can affect which legal pathways remain available. And that is why legal observers began paying closer attention to the way different claims were structured in the amended complaint and second amended complaint. If the court determines that some claims rely on statutes that do not apply in this context, or that certain allegations overlap with other legal claims, those portions of the case could potentially face additional scrutiny. At the same time, the court must also consider whether the pleadings, taken together with the documents attached to them, establish legally sufficient claims under applicable law. And that balance between legal sufficiency and evidentiary support is precisely what makes the pending motions so significant. Because depending on how the federal judge approaches the procedural questions already discussed, the outcome of those motions could shape the trajectory of the entire case. But there is another legal issue that observers following the Blake Lively case began discussing once the pending motions came into focus. And it involves a principle that often becomes decisive in federal litigation: the statute of limitations. In many employment-related disputes, federal law requires certain steps to occur within specific timeframes. One example is filing with the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is often required before discrimination claims can proceed under federal statutes such as Title VII. If those deadlines are missed, courts sometimes determine that a claim may be time-barred, meaning it cannot proceed regardless of the evidence presented later. That possibility is one reason the defendant's summary judgment motion has drawn attention from legal commentators, because summary judgment allows the federal judge to evaluate not only the evidence gathered during discovery, but also whether the claims themselves meet the legal requirements necessary to move forward. In other words, the court is not limited to deciding factual disputes. The court can also examine whether a claim is legally viable under the applicable statutes. And if a claim were determined to be time-barred, that issue could potentially affect the scope of what ultimately reaches a jury. Of course, these are the kinds of legal questions judges routinely analyze during summary judgment review. Courts often look at the summary judgment record, the filings submitted by both sides, and the legal standards governing the claims. That process can involve careful evaluation of timelines, procedural filings, and the sequence of events described in the complaint and amended complaint. Many viewers following the case began noting that these legal timing issues may become increasingly important depending on how the court rules on the pending motions. Because if the judge resolves certain procedural questions first, including the motion for judgment on the pleadings, the legal landscape of the case could change quickly. And that brings the focus back to the central question many observers are now asking: which motion will the federal judge address first?
And this is where the situation inside the Blake Lively case begins to tighten even further, because the federal judge is currently facing two separate dispositive motions: the defendant's summary judgment motion and the motion for judgment on the pleadings under Rule 12c. Both of these legal tools allow a court to resolve parts of a case before it ever reaches a jury, but they operate very differently. If the court focuses first on the motion for judgment on the pleadings, the judge will primarily examine the complaint, the answer, and the documents attached to the pleadings, such as the contract and offer letter referenced in earlier filings. The court would then determine whether the claims on their face establish a legally valid cause of action. If they do not, certain claims could potentially be dismissed at that stage. But if the court turns first to summary judgment, the analysis shifts to the summary judgment record, including the evidence gathered during discovery, witness statements, and other materials submitted by both sides. That approach asks a different question. Are there genuine disputes of material fact that must be decided by a jury? Or does the record evidence show that the case can be resolved as a matter of law? This is why the recent court filing referencing Miller versus Lamanna has drawn so much attention from people watching the case unfold. The filing appears to encourage the court to prioritize analysis of the summary judgment record, but judges retain broad discretion when evaluating appellate precedent. They may determine whether a cited case truly applies to the procedural posture of the dispute before them. And that means the federal judge could ultimately decide that the precedent cited in the filing is distinguishable from the circumstances in this case. If that happens, the court could still move forward with the Rule 12c judgment on the pleadings analysis. And that decision, which procedural path the judge chooses, could shape what happens to the case next.
At this point, the next move belongs to the federal judge. The court has before it both the summary judgment motion and the Rule 12c motion for judgment on the pleadings, along with the recent court filing citing Miller versus Lamanna from the Second Circuit Court. Each of these elements introduces different legal standards the court may apply when evaluating the case. For viewers closely following the situation, the key question is not just what the ruling will be, but which motion the judge addresses first. If the court proceeds with the judgment on the pleadings, the focus will remain on the pleadings, the complaint, and the legal sufficiency of the claims themselves. If the court instead prioritizes summary judgment, the analysis shifts toward the evidence gathered during discovery and the summary judgment record. Both paths could significantly shape the future of the case. Many observers are now watching closely to see whether the court finds the appellate precedent cited by Lively's legal team persuasive, or whether the judge concludes that the case before the court presents a different procedural situation. Because once that decision is made, the direction of the litigation may become much clearer. And that is why this latest filing has quickly become a focal point in the unfolding legal story.